Good afternoon, everybody. Is this on? Yes. David Astrove, President of the Congregation, and I welcome you all to this wonderful afternoon event on this Yom Kippur day. This is really a prime example of how we all benefit from Rabbi Lustig's never-ending, unyielding search for opportunities for us as his congregants to challenge ourselves, to look within, to work with him and at his behest for a better world. Today what he did is he reached out to two of his personal friends who are also colleagues of his, companions of his in an unyielding search, an effort on behalf of the three of them to find ways to build bridges among all of us and between us and to achieve a better world for tomorrow. These two men are not strangers to this congregation. Cornell Brooks, the past president of the NAACP, has graced our pulpit and preached to us on a number of occasions. And Imam Johari, who, I'm sorry, I'm just going to have to read it so I get it right, formerly with the Dar Al-Hijrah Islamic Center, is similarly a friend of this congregation. He not only has spoken from our pulpit, he has dined with us in this room, shared meals, shared conversations, shared thoughts, and challenged us all. So I'm going to get out of the way and turn it over to the three of them, and we'll all learn together. Thank you.
Thank you, David. So first, the question that my mother always says to Ange, can you hear me? This is, no, all right. There we go. Is that better? No. So first I'm going to ask you if you can, there are seats on the side if anybody comes in. There are plenty of seats. And also I want to thank, in the middle of the summer, or actually a while ago, I think I sent each of them a text, as we often do, probably in the middle of the night, which they laugh about, to ask them to come to speak on Yom Kippur afternoon on Prejudice, Race, and Religion. That was really probably 2 or 3 months ago, before all that has gone on. It was before Charlottesville. It was before a lot of the rhetoric that has gone on. But I want to give a little more background on these two individuals because I don't want to take it for granted that you really know who they are and what goes on. Imam Johari Abdul-Malik has been a longtime friend of the congregation. He has been an activist in the Washington, D.C. area since the mid-60s. He was a student at Howard University. He became one of the first chaplains, the first Muslim chaplain at Howard University. He grew up in Brooklyn. He was involved in community activism. He's known nationally for his work. He has joined us, and he reminds me all the time. I was kvetching a little bit about having to fast, but I've been with the Imam when he's in the month of Ramadan. It doesn't stop him at all. He is on his toes, so basically I'm the fasting wimp up here. He's also fasting because it coincides that the first month of our new year is also the first month in Islam, and there's a fast today, so he has to show me up once again. Imam Johari is one of the most articulate men around. His background, and he came to Islam on his own after a real search. And long before anybody was fighting much of the issues of Islamophobia, Imam Johari was making a way because through his compassion and his activism as a civil rights activist, he was simultaneously introducing many people to Islam. He took a stance last year and left his congregation on a matter of principle, and I'll ask him about that a little back later. But that is what is true about him. He is unyielding in his concepts of principles. And I have been blessed to have him as my friend, to have him as an advisor, to have him as a person. We have walked down Massachusetts Avenue together on the Unity Walk before it started. And we both stopped, and I asked him a question in front of the mosque that I'm going to talk about a little later today. I turned to him, and I think I starred him a little bit. I talked about in this year, we lost Isaac Fullwood, we lost Louis Anthony, and we lost Jim Vance. And I turned and I said, and I looked at him, and all three people, and I said to Imam Johari, I said, where are those are three incredible African Americans who made an impact in our city. Where are the Jewish heroes? And he was startled at the question, but it's one that we're going to look at in a little bit. But I want to thank him for being here and for doing and for all that he's done. Cornell Brooks is the busiest man on the face of the earth. I have to tell you, twice when I tried to reach the Obama administration, I got to the president quicker than I got to the president of the NAACP. Cornell Brooks is now, he's a visiting professor. He's a scholar at Boston University, at Harvard University, and at the Brennan Center as well. And he's also was the distinguished alumni from Boston. He teaches both in the College of Law, he teaches in theology, and what most people, until you hear him preach, don't know is he's an ordained minister first and foremost. And he never wavers from the Word of God. And Cornell is an incredible individual. I got to know Cornell most by watching a man who in the Alabama heat. Now I'm used to the Alabama heat. I grew up in Nashville, Tennessee. And it was hot on those roads because when you're walking from Selma, Alabama to Washington, D.C., and you're walking on pavement, asphalt, blacktop as we used to call it, that's bubbling, and you have to get it off your shoes at the end of the day. He was not going to miss the integrity. He would have the guys with the pedometers or whatever it makes you walk, and they would say, well, we really didn't walk the 35 or 40 miles. He would get up at 6 in the morning before the rest of us got and make up that difference. And that's the type of principled individual he is. He does not waver on principles. And partially, he was the 18th president of the NAACP. He took that position on the 60th anniversary of Brown versus the Board of Education. And from that moment forward, he brought the NAACP more litigation, more opportunities to make sure that voters' rights were preserved. And he marched from Selma, Alabama to Washington Hebrew congregation. Oh yeah, I meant to the Capitol. It's all a matter of your perspective. And we welcome there. It was one of the greatest honors for our congregation that Cornell did this. Enough with introductions. They're amazing interventions. I asked them each to speak a little bit about where does this conflict between these pillars of prejudice, race, and religion. What's interesting is that both of these men have been activists in the political world. They're both religious leaders, and they're both men of color who've grown up in America that isn't always just as it should be. So I've asked them to give us a little introduction. We're going to then go into a little bit of dialogue, and then we'll leave some time at the end from questions. We'll do it the style that we do in the Scholar Series. You'll raise your hand. One of our ushers will bring that. And I know this is a Jewish crowd, so they're questions, not speeches, but we'll manage. So, Cornell, would you like to start?
Good afternoon. Can everyone hear me? Well, first of all, let me just say on this, the holiest day of the year, I pray that everyone, your fast is easy and that you continue to grow in your strength as the day goes on. I'm delighted, honored to be here at Washington Hebrew Congregation. I will never forget that after we endured a journey of 1,002 miles from Selma, Alabama to Washington, D.C., there was at the end of that journey a synagogue that lifted up radical hospitality, as your rabbi so noted, fed us, took care of us, extended the hospitality of the desert to us as we entered Washington, D.C. And so for that, I simply want to say again, thank you. To my brother in the faith, Bruce Lustig, who has been here for me and for my family, I want to say thank you. And certainly to the Imam with whom we have served and have been here at the congregation before. So when the rabbi reached out to me and asked to participate in this service and to reflect on race and religion on this holy day, I thought that that was a difficult burden to bear, but in the wake of Charlottesville, in the wake of all of the divisive rhetoric that we've heard and been witness to over these many months, when I think about Charlottesville, I think about it as both metaphor for the present condition and also message as to future possibilities. I cannot erase from memory or from hearing a group of young men marching through the city of Charlottesville, the town of Charlottesville, chanting, "The Jews will not replace us, they will not replace us," meaning African Americans. This was a moment that called for a strong response by the whole of the country across the length and breadth of our republic. What we saw in the wake of this tragic event was equivocation, not merely at the highest levels of government, but in various levels of government. It was a moment where we as a country had the opportunity to atone, to examine ourselves, to ask ourselves the hard question, not merely what happened in the streets of Charlottesville, but what gave rise to it. What gave rise to this toxic brew of racism and anti-Semitism coming out of the mouths of young men? What gave rise to an act of violence that caused a young woman to lose her life? What is it about our republic, about our country, about our society, about our community, about us as people of faith, as Jews, as Christians, as Baptists, as Episcopalians, as Muslims, as agnostics? What gave rise to that? And one of the things I'm left with is something that one of my former professors at Boston University lifted up over many years. That is Elie Wiesel, who noted that the opposite of love was not hate, but rather indifference. Indifference with respect to the anti-Semitism in our midst, the racism in our midst, but also the race baiting in our midst. The dog whistles that have been blown long and loud, and we have pretended to be shocked and amazed at the fact that our neighbors and fellow citizens have snarled and growled and bitten one another. This is a moment where we have been indifferent, and the indifference has been made manifest. So now, in the wake of Charlottesville, this is an occasion for us, I think, on an ongoing basis, to ask ourselves some of the questions that the rabbi lifted up. Where's the leadership? And I'll simply put this question before you. There was an ecumenical response to Charlottesville. But was there an African American and Jewish response to Charlottesville as such? In other words, the moral ugliness had a particularity that speaks to our need to respond with particularity and universality. So in other words, we respond out of our humanity, out of our shared faith, but we also respond as blacks and Jews. I think that's important, because people need to understand that we are here for one another as human beings, as those who dwell in the same house of faith, but they also need to know that it is because of our faith that we will not equivocate, we will not shrink in the face of bigotry, we will not pretend to be bashful about our beliefs, and we will stand up to racism and anti-Semitism as it manifests itself anywhere, anytime, as practiced by anyone. That, I think, is a challenge for us today.
Thank you. Imam. Or 5. 2 or 3.
Peace. First, I just really, in the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful, I would like to thank you all for the thoughtfulness of this invitation. As Bruce said, I grew up in Brooklyn, which makes me part Jewish. It just so happens I'm also fasting today, which I guess only adds to my Jewish heritage. But if we are to think about this day, some translate as a day of atonement, day of self-reflection. We can't divorce ourselves from the moment that we are all living in. That while we look at this particular time, to remember that the ideals of justice are not static. That the idea of justice is a dynamic process. It's like love. Love is a verb. If we are to do justice, then that sense of justice has to be ever present with us. It should not take the events of Charlottesville to awaken us from the perhaps narcotized existence that many of us have been enjoying in the post-60s era. I remember when I came to Washington, across the river in Virginia, segregation was alive and well. And the sign that said no blacks, no Jews, and no dogs allowed didn't have rust on them. Dr. King reminds us maybe that there were people who are like Rip Van Winkle. They slept through a revolution. There are many of you, and I was told I should speak quite bluntly today. I talked with, you don't know that Bruce Lustig he now has a new rap DJ name, DJ Blunt. He's got his mic. I want us to be honest and search our souls for just a few minutes. Maybe it might resonate through you tonight while you're fasting and you're preparing to end your fast. Some of us have slept through a revolution. That when Jews and blacks began to make a certain level of ascendancy after the death of Dr. King, we forgot something. After the martyrdom of Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney, we forgot what they were marching for. And that is that Dr. King's march and leadership was leading a poor people's campaign, not a black people's campaign. It wasn't a Jewish people's campaign. It wasn't a Latino or a LGBTQ campaign. It was a campaign about poor people in America. Now, you and I may have forgotten, and we now use terms like the Rust Belt as a destination. It is a condition of people, our fellow Americans, that after Jews could go anywhere they want to go, and blacks could eat anywhere they want to eat, that our brothers and sisters in Appalachia still couldn't afford to eat or to live wherever they wanted to live. trailer trash, some kind of expression we use as an off-colored joke. We used to use other words for blacks and Jews. It's not okay to talk about us like that anymore, but we can still joke about them. And so I'm saying to you today, you need to wake up. We need to commit ourselves maybe to having a poor people's campaign again. Do you know they have something called the vanishing middle class? The vanishing middle class. That white Americans who live in the middle are moving down. We read about it, they feel it. Their job is going to Mexico and to China, and it is never coming back. Their children will not earn as much as their parents, nor will they be able to afford, many of them, to buy a home. The great American dream. Our challenge while we atone, and I'm atoning, and I said this before to Bruce, I apologize to my white brothers and sisters, because I got so happy with all of my new rights that I'm still fighting for. But I forgot about my brother. I'm saying to you and I today, we need to wake up. Patriotism means to resist. And by the way, white supremacy, whether they realize it or not, was designed to divide us for the benefit of the 1%. It never was about all of the white lumpen proletariat. And so while we are concerned, the real question is, where are the Goodman, Cheneys, and the Schwerners today, who are willing to go out to meet our angry, hungry neighbor and to say, I know you probably think that I'm here for something else. I left the comfort of where I was, even with this discrimination and racism, to come and join you so that we could build a better America together. I ask God to forgive me and you for our neglect, for those who among us were suffering silently, who have now become vocal.
So this is not a new message from... In fact, when we stood in front of the mosque at the end of the Faith Over Fear March, it was Imam Johari who stood up and said very similar words, who said, we ought not to, we can be offended by the rhetoric, but we have to recognize who's saying the rhetoric and why. And I think that's a critical point. Now, what I want to ask about here, and it's really important because you brought up something in Darden, is that the question, in a sense, of all of a sudden after Charlottesville, there has been an awakening to a degree, perhaps in the Jewish community, that maybe, wow, we are part of the other. Because I think, in a sense, we not only forgot about being the other, but we enjoyed privilege too much and were perhaps part of a socioeconomic system that was creating the situations that were so difficult for others. When we were on the march, there was an incredible woman who came. She was a CEO somewhere, and I sat next to her, and we were in that first night when we were in the Catholic school, and we were spending the night over a Catholic school, by the way, that accepted individuals on the first march and lost 80% of its backing from Catholics in the area for supporting Martin Luther King at that time. And I overheard a woman, and I'll never forget this, a woman I'd marched with. She used the word Marcus. Of course, I perked up. My son's name is Marcus. And she said, what do you mean you let Marcus? And I was over, and I apologized afterwards for eavesdropping. And she asked, why are you crying? And I said, I'm ashamed. Why was I ashamed? What was she worried about? She was on a march with her youngest daughter and her son, and her husband was at home and let her 19-year-old son take her car, even though he knew it had a taillight out. She was worried about her son coming home alive.
Break it down.
Now, I'm a child of a Holocaust survivor, and I lived in the Deep South. But I today do not worry about my child coming home alive because a taillight may be missing. And so how do we deal with this issue, which is for us in the central point? Where are the lines now of being complicit? Where are the lines? You mentioned in this, teacher Elie Wiesel, and Wiesel was the one who stood and told us that, in Sarajevo, we can't be quiet. This wasn't because it wasn't happening to Jews. It was still never again means never again. It's not never again for Jews. It's just never again.
That's right.
Cornell, you've been on the front lines of this. You had more lawsuits. If people could turn off their cell phones, that's going to be my first book, The Inopportune Ring. So what I'd like to ask you, how do we deal with this, and what are the levels of being complicit? And because we have voter registration that's being totally dismantled. We have the poor people in terms of these issues. We have, and I also want to ask you about institutions. The oldest civil rights institution in America, which you led so strongly, in a sense, in their letting you go, showed once again that they couldn't hold on to their leadership because there's the internal strife that takes place in a conflict, and the same thing within the Jewish community, I'm sure in the Islamic community. We fight amongst ourselves so much we can't often get some things done. Where are these lines of complicity today?
So let me just start with this whole question of whose interests are at stake. So when we talk about American Jews having a stake in the progress of the nation with respect to discrimination, and there's this notion of, well, if we've arrived, if we're doing pretty well, what stake do we have in this battle against discrimination? This is not a morally unique question with respect to Jews. So when African Americans who are upper middle class, whose children go to Howard, Hampton, and Harvard, they too have to ask the question, well, how does this impact us? When we think about Charlottesville, think about this. The likelihood of any of us being subject to racial or ethnic vigilantes is small. But the possibility that it could happen to any of us or any of our children is such that what happened in Charlottesville was an assault on our dignity, whether or not we were there, whether or not we were threatened. And so when someone walks through the streets of an American city and says Jews will not replace us, it is an offense and it is an assault on us all, whether or not we are personally affected. And so the point being is we have to all engage in a certain kind of moral extrapolation, meaning what happens over there affects us here. Point one. Point two, when we talk about our institutions, this is not unique to the NAACP. It's not unique to American synagogues. I've heard of that too, in terms of churches like synagogues holding on to their rabbis and ministers, or the NAACP holding on to its CEOs. It's really a tension between the past and the present. And what I mean by that is having large institutions, deeply historic institutions, responding to the cry for social justice in the streets. And so in other words, when your children and grandchildren are pressing for change faster than you're comfortable with on the inside of our churches, our synagogues, our mosques, and even if we dare say the NAACP, we have to get comfortable with the idea that our institutions have to change. That's not a particular criticism of the NAACP, but it is a charge to us all. And what I mean by that is this. When the NAACP grows by 90%, the membership rate in a year, when we're attracting Latinos, African Americans, Jews, young people, older people, we need to double down on that. It's not the time to retreat.
Right.
Similarly, when our mosques, churches, and synagogues are reaching out to the community, you're bringing people in the doors, you're expanding your outreach, it's not the time to retreat. It means that all of us have to be less risk averse when it comes to loving all of us. We have to take chances. We have to engage in risky ministry. We have to meet people, engage with people, partner with people with whom we've never partnered with before. This is as old as our faith.
I want to ask both of you about a critical question because, Cornell, you and I, we both have children about the same age. My daughter, after you had Seder at our house, was texting with your daughter, and I don't know, they can do it in times that we can't, and they all had mutual friends in a sense. I remember when you were deciding what you were going to do, Cornell, we were on the phone, and you were talking, I was asking her to do, you had incredible offers, you could have been on CNN every night and whatever, and you told me that you chose to be on the campus, the university campus. You told me that doing this in the march from Selma was also so that there could be a visible way for young people, and in that march, the most important people that you inspired were the young people that marched with you in St. Louis after Michael Brown, all of these situations. So as we face this, look, the crowd that's in here, they've seen, they participate, whatever. I want to talk, how do we address the crowd that's not in here? How do we inspire in terms of this? Imam Johari, our youth groups have worked together for a long time. He just asked me for it. This past weekend, our kids made peace benches. And they've been here, and he made sure his kids, not the adults from his congregation, were here on Martin Luther King Work Day, but he'd have 45 children here on Martin Luther. 75, excuse me. Well, that'll be the first time that I didn't over-exaggerate something. So how, for both of you, what is it that we do and what can we do to inspire and to make sure that this message, simultaneously while we're doing the work that needs to be done, we have to also make sure that we're inspiring and engaging. Because the college campus is not the safe place. There were swastikas, 5 of them, at Georgetown University, where my son goes. We don't know who it came. There was rope hanging from American University. And God knows the things that have been unreported at the schools of the SEC. So what's the answer?
If we had to answer, we'd be, I don't know what we'd be doing if we had to answer. But what we can do is, without a doubt, recognize, I think, what Rabbi Hillel said this, because I just Googled it. If I'm not for myself, who will be for me? If I'm only for myself, who am I? And by the way, we've been hung up for a while on only being for me. And if not now, when? This is a defining moment, but I don't want us to get the moment wrong. Right now, I'm supposed to be at 2 different events. One, a march for racial justice on the mall. I pop in and pop out. And we're having a mini conference at Howard, meeting with African American students talking about the state of Islam in Black America. Because some of the students presented at papers last night said, we as Muslims lost our sense of social justice. We got all caught up in how long your clothes are and how you wash before you pray. He said we've gone from the back of the bus as African Americans to the back of the camels. That we've lost our sense of what our faith leads us to be doing. Fortunately, this is not a synagogue where you can be comfortable. But there are many houses of worship, organizations, that they go along to get along. I was in a meeting the other day, they're talking about who was at the White House iftar dinner. I said, last time I was invited to the White House iftar dinner, we had students who were protesting in front of the White House. We broke fast and fed homeless people. It was on TV. That was my last invite. That's fine, because the prophetic call is always to be the one outside the house of Pharaoh calling him to justice. So I'm saying to you, if we continue to do that, we're on Facebook right now. That's how you do it. It's getting, my daughter's calling me, amazing. She's out there. She's like, where are you, Dad? Come in.
You probably told her where you were.
Yeah, oh, yeah. But our challenge, I mean, we've got a multi-generational problem. Look around. Look around. If this is, in this synagogue, the holiest day of the year, and people like me missing some, and the rest is gray, we're not doing enough in our own families. Our individualism has to be matched by our collectivism. If I'm going to get my people working, I got to go and say, Cornell, I need you. I'm not sending out on Facebook. I need you to be with me as we march here. Not, I told all my friends what a great thing we're doing at my synagogue. Tell my children, you better be here. Call to your friends. I'm going to pick them up. Tell them what time. Because we have to do this now. And by God, I believe that while all the anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, whatever's going on, it was really just God waking us up to the problem that our neighbor had. You think it's about you. You think the swastika is about you. It's not about you. It's about somebody who's saying, we don't want to become foreigners in our own country. And they've lost their own ideals. We claim that we are the possessors of those ideals. Then we need to put them in the street and grab our neighbor and pull them and bring them in with us, kicking and screaming. And by the way, I believe as this is happening, we're already winning. Right? When the dogs are called on the people in the civil rights movement and it's on television and people say, oh my God, you won. It's when they don't hear it and they don't see it. And the best person to convey the message, Bruce, I'm gonna digress for just a moment.
Sure.
Years ago, great study was done looking at the two most popular cars in America. Honda Accord, Toyota Camry. They studied thousands of cars. And they put their report together, which one of them is the best vehicle. Then they asked consumers, what was the most impactful thing that made you buy the automobile that you drive? You know what they said? I know somebody who drives that one and they told me about it. That's where you are. I know the television is having all kind of reach and negative media, but the person who sits next to you and says, what do you think about what Clark Lowenstein calls the water cooler moment? You at the water cooler moment, somebody says something racist, right? About somebody black or Hispanic, and you're Jewish and you don't say anything. You just gave away all your power. Right? You could look at them and say, you know what? I'm a Jew. Are they uncomfortable? Right? They might say, I'm Jewish too, you didn't know. But that is not acceptable in my social circle. And then move them to the collective.
And I think that example, I want to thank you. Cornell, you're on 3 universities, you know, prestigious places. You see all sorts of things. Tell us what you think what is it that we need to be doing for this next generation?
So one of the things I'm greatly encouraged by is the fact that you have a millennial generation in the midst of a Twitter age civil rights movement desperately wanting to hear from those who are older and who are wiser. It's not a matter of...
Isn't that dangerous that we're now older and wiser? Go ahead.
Particularly if we're only older and not wiser.
Right.
The challenge becomes, sometimes we're good at preaching at our young people as opposed to engaging with. And so one of the things that we are endeavoring to do, certainly in Boston University and at Harvard, is to create opportunities for young people to lead. And so one of the things that I think is incredibly important about the work that I see being done at Washington Hebrew Congregation is giving young people an opportunity to lead. Don't prescribe the way it should be done. You can ask them to get something accomplished, but leave it up to them to get there. And I'll give you a concrete example. Before I came to the NAACP, I worked on something called a ban the box law. A law to remove the box that asks the question, seemingly innocuous question, have you ever been arrested or convicted of a crime? If you check the box, it dramatically reduces your opportunity to work. This is tremendously impactful, disastrously impactful for many of African Americans and Latinos with minor drug offenses. A group of students from Princeton came into my office one day and said, we want to work on your legislation. We already have a plan. I said, well, I'll tell you what. You execute your plan, touch base with home base every now and then, and as long as it won't kill us, could help us, try it. They place articles in the Washington Post, The Nation, PBS. They took on the administration at Princeton to get the box removed from the Princeton application, and we passed that law. Here's the point. Trust young people to lead. Do not be morally timid. Give them morally ambitious projects to engage in. And I'll note this. The number one issue among millennials is racial justice. That's what the polling says. This congregation has led in that regard. And you've done it for years. And I gotta believe that there are young people here who want to lead on that issue. If you let them lead, you don't have to worry about them participating. Because here's what I find. Whenever you ask young people to lead, you don't have to worry about them being a member.
But I'm going to be honest with you, that one of the things that I find from a number of the students on the college campus, because there's such a visceral response, and the fact that there's not an interest in dialogue. So when the BDS issue comes up, when somebody who's middle of the road in terms of it, and the attacks on them because you're guilty by association. So you go to Hillel for dinner, and all of a sudden you're attacked because you're part of BDS. So now this environment is that fear of being labeled in a sense, and even in a sense, you know, I had to speak because, and you and I talked about this, the Black Lives Matter, you know, I don't remember how many billions of words was in it. It had 13 or 130 words that called into question in terms of some of the issues about Israel. Now, there's nothing that they called into question that I, as a Reform rabbi, haven't called into question. But it's a different thing when you're calling something out yourself and others are calling, and when you're accusing and doing this. So this labeling, this idea of labeling all African Americans in one pile, all Muslims in one pile, all Jews in one pile, is one of the simplest things that goes on. And we have to recognize and not be foolish. Because I still am on the mailing list and get all these emails because I want to see what's going on. Some of the tweets, some of the things that are coming are not just people blowing steam off. They're by design. And the switching of an issue that to turn around taking a knee out of civil disobedience and patriotic protest to something that you think that there's injustice for African Americans in our system, and all of a sudden turning and saying that you're against the flag, we can't stand up to those things because that's turning away the sense. Now, what's amazing is the football community responded and responded strong. So if you talk, and not only, but in terms of, so what are the elements in terms that we come to, if I was going to ask you for the Jewish community, and asking you as both men of faith and both as men of color who are fighting for social justice for all, what do you think is the most impactful and most important thing that we collectively as a Jewish community could do?
You mind if I just
No, please,
address
please. No problem.
the BDS question?
Yep, do.
Here's a challenge. When someone comes to your house and is critical of those who live in your house, and you're not sure whether or not they love the folks in your house, whether they respect the people in your house, and they're guests in your house. The problem here is on the college campus, we have Jewish students being ostracized, Jewish students being marginalized, Jewish students being pushed out because of assumptions about the state of Israel, without a demonstrated commitment to the well-being of the state of Israel. The point being here is Jewish students cannot be marginalized in terms of doing the justice work that their own faith dictates. And I don't think anybody needs to apologize for that. I don't think anybody needs to back away from that. That simply is. Point two, when we look at the history, if we look at SNCC in the 1960s, it was a pretty infamous newsletter that was anti-Semitic. That created a rift and a division in our community that we need not repeat. I think that's incredibly important here. Now, with respect to the most important thing the Jewish community can do, I would simply say this. It's the same thing that the African American Christian community, and I would suggest the same thing is true of the Muslim community, which is to say, let us not be bashful with respect to exercising and implementing our faith in the public square. What I mean by that is, when it comes to taking on these issues, we cannot two-step. We can't sidestep. We can't back away. We need to double down. And so when I hear people saying, well, you can't participate in this justice movement because you support the state of Israel. Who says? Who says? Who are you, who is any of us to challenge how we march in step with our God?
Well,
point, period, paragraph.
And I think this is really important. I got some of my Muslim friends out of joint. On one night there was a conversation going on because they wanted Imam Johari to be quiet because he'd been disinvited to speak in front of the, was it the legislature or?
Yeah, it was in the house.
So somebody turned to me and said, you know, really, Rabbi, this is our sort of situation. And I said, it's not your situation. Because if they're not letting Imam Johari speak and I don't speak up, and I don't stand up for him, what's going to happen when they say Lustig can't speak because of this reason and that reason? On the day after Charlottesville, I watched and I couldn't believe what I saw. I really couldn't believe. Now, I grew up with a grandfather who was a Holocaust survivor who in the Jim Crow era in Nashville, Tennessee, took his grandson into the colored bathrooms. Because after being in a camp, He was not going to have that type of distinction being made.
That's right.
Now, at the same time in the morning I woke up, I called Rabbi Miller, and we went to church. Went to one of the largest African American churches around. Reverend Jenkins. And boy, can they pray and sing there. And when I went up afterwards, I said there was no other place that I wanted to be. And I told him that if those white supremacists come and march or protest in front of your church, I will gather members of Washington Hebrew to make a circle around it. And then he said the thing I hoped he would say. If they come to Washington Hebrew, he said, he would make a circle around Washington Hebrew. Now that is something that we have to do, but I'm telling you, on the college campus, you know how difficult it is, even for those who've been active in high school, being there and not having the support. It is very difficult to stand up, not only as Jews in the BDS environment, but people of color and people of Islamic faith. They feel marginalized on these institutions. And it's very difficult. And it's often being marginalized by people who are on the margins, which makes no sense. Your answer to our situation. What do you want from the Jewish community, Imam Johari?
I want more of what we have now. I was saying I just want more of what we have now. The challenge for us on many levels is to deepen our relationships. We've done a lot of that work here, where it's not just, okay, you know, the priest, the rabbi, and the imam, that's a joke. But actually taking it down to the next level, and then taking it down to the level not just of the grass tops, but down to bringing it down to the grassroots. And I can tell you, you probably don't know this, but some of the dinners that we've enjoyed over the past decade and a half, and I bring people from the mosque, some of them think that all Jews, I like this, are Zionist. And then I say, guess what? Not all Zionists are Zionists. And they're like, what do you mean? So, well, your idea of what a Zionist is somebody who wants to put all of the Muslims inside of a concentration camp. That's what a Zionist is. But then you met somebody else who says, I'm a Zionist. It just means that, I believe that as a Jew, I would love to live in the Holy Land. And I don't mind living there with Christians and Muslims either, as a Zionist. And they're like, get on the bus and come with us to Washington Hebrew. And we're going to have a discussion about something, and they have good food and whatever. And they're getting on the bus and they're saying, why are we getting on the bus going to have dinner with a bunch of Zionists? And then somebody says, Imam, we had a good time. When are we going back to that synagogue again? And those are people who go back.
All that brisket diplomacy.
Yeah, brisket diplomacy. Works every time. And these are older people. People whose minds have really been, ossified. They're solid in their understanding of what they think Jews are. And when those ambassadors go back and they talk with other Palestinians and say, they're not all like what you think they are. It's deepening that work. That is the work that we need to do. The other piece is that, going back to this issue of racism, we probably can't end racism. We can make it illegal to act on your racism. And that means moving people to a place where they fight for the kind of accommodations that everyone should have. In the Montgomery bus boycott, they realized that they couldn't end racism. They couldn't stop white people from hating black people or whatever. But they could say that you can't deny a person
a seat on the bus because of their color. And that is something that you can fight for and you can change. And that means on a level, Bruce, with the work that we do, and I know you're already doing this work, is getting down in the weeds that says, if gentrification is a code word for racism, then we need to march to the place that says there have to be some legal accommodations to make sure that people who live and work in this community can continue to work and live in this community.
Well, I want to, this is our season of real reflection. And I have to tell you, I think one of the most powerful things that I've done in my life was just a couple of days I spent walking from Selma. I'd been a rabbi in Selma. I knew all the press when they showed up because they were all Jewish reporters who had been members of my congregation there. And it was very powerful. And spending the time as we did with Middle Passage. And I know you know the story. There was a man who was a veteran who went on the walk because he wanted to honor his brother who had died, who was a preacher. And he had never really taken on the cause, and he was from Colorado and did that. And he died, and his last efforts staying alive were trying to keep the flag that he was holding from hitting the ground. In that moment, what he taught us was he wasn't walking because he was a man of color. He was walking because he was a man of faith, and he believed what that flag stood for, and his faith was simultaneous with what it meant to be an American. And we're here today because there's so many things that our Jewish identity and our Jewish value, our Torah, coincides and coalesces with the values and the fights for the African American community, coalesce with what Muslims are going through, are confluent with so many things.
And poor white people.
And the poor, no matter what their color.
That's right.
I said, last night I talked about there's an evangelical church. We sent all of our food and all of our stuff down to this evangelical church. They were the only people who were doing things not based on color or creed, but simply helping people about need. And read the article, because what happened is the floods and the work is not dividing people.
That's right.
It's uniting people. I want to thank you, and I want to thank you personally. You've both been incredible teachers to me and to my congregation. Each of you has taken personal sacrifice because of principle. Each of you has made choices in your life. This guy's got he's got a PhD in genetics and chemistry and whatever, and he's doing other things. Cornell could have been a highfalutin commentator on things, but these men have chosen to be in the fight because they believe in the righteousness. I want to tell you, we applaud you as our teachers. And there's no more important thing that we could be doing on this Day of Atonement than talking about this issue, because this issue not only has to do with our soul, it has to do with all of our souls. So I want to thank you. I'll end with the other quote that is from our tradition. Lo hamlacha ligmor. It's not upon us to finish the task, but neither are we allowed to desist from it. So it's a long journey. It's going to be a hard road to hoe. But somebody told us, hold on. Hold on. We're going to hang on. I want to thank these gentlemen, and I applaud you for joining us.